Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are referred to as the patriarchs because the entire nation of Israel traced its lineage through them. But Jacob's 12 sons did not all become separate nations. Rather, they made up the nation of Israel. One of the biggest reasons they were able to stay together had a lot to do with son number 11. Let's take a quick look at our timeline. Jacob was probably born just before 2000. Not long after 2000, his grandfather Abraham died. Jacob had most of his own children probably between the 1950s and 1920s, but that window could be much tighter because his children had 4 different mothers, so the usual minimum gap of close to a year only applies to consecutive births of the same mother. And given the Bible's frequent preference to write thematically as opposed to chronologically, it's not impossible that, for example, Dan was born before Judah. However, the Bible does indicate a significant gap before Joseph was born, and the biblical account mostly follows him. Jacob favored his son Joseph, much like his own mother Rebekah had favored him over his brother Esau. Now, this preference manifested itself in an ornate robe that Jacob made for his son Joseph when he was 17. His brothers, Joseph's brothers, the rest of Jacob's sons, clearly saw this favoritism, and they were hurt by it. They directed their resentment not toward their father, but toward their brother. Joseph himself apparently made very little effort to ease tension, instead volunteering the details of dreams he had that clearly symbolized his family members bowing down to him. And one of the most well-known accounts of the Old Testament is from Genesis 37. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into the cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. The cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." His brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Joseph's brothers then took Joseph's coat, put blood on it, and showed it to their father and said, "Hey, take a look at this. This isn't Joseph's, is it?" And so Jacob would mourn the loss of his son, and the other brothers would simply not worry about him anymore. Meanwhile, Joseph was sold to Egypt as a slave. Within days, perhaps weeks, he had gone from being his father's favorite in a large family to being sold as a slave in a land he did not know. One theme that comes out pretty clearly in the account of Joseph is trust in God. He simply does not always give us what we want or what we think we need, but he does not forget us. The Lord made sure that Joseph prospered. He was sold to a man named Potiphar, a high-ranking official in Egypt, and eventually he promoted him. It was a great step forward, but then it was 2 steps back. Potiphar's wife tried to seduce Joseph. Joseph wasn't having that, so she was disappointed, obviously, and probably a little bit embarrassed. So she turned it around on Joseph. She told her husband that Joseph was the one who had come on to her. So Potiphar had Joseph thrown into prison. But the Lord was not done with Joseph. He continued to be with him, especially in the ability to interpret dreams. It came to pass that Pharaoh needed a dream interpreted. No one could do it. But he was told that some Hebrew guy in prison was doing a pretty good job of interpreting dreams. So he sent for him. Joseph did indeed interpret Pharaoh's dream for him, announcing that famine was coming and that they had to do something quickly or it would affect them because there were before the famine going to be years of plenty. Pharaoh immediately promoted Joseph to second in command, recognizing that he had been given divine wisdom. And that is how Israel's history in Egypt began. Now, who was this Pharaoh? When you look at Egyptian chronology, names are given to the different periods of time. The Old Kingdom predates Abraham. This is likely the period during which most of Genesis takes place. The first intermediate period was a time of unrest. Unity was broken in favor of city-states until finally Mentuhotep reunited Egypt, ushering in the Middle Kingdom. Some of Genesis takes place during this Middle Kingdom period, and if Joseph went to Egypt about 1900, the likely candidates for pharaohs over him are Amenemhat II, Senusret II, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III. During the years ahead of the drought, Egypt, under the direction of Joseph, made sure that food was stockpiled for the years of famine. Because the famine was widespread, the rest of Joseph's family came to Egypt seeking food. So Jacob sent 10 of his sons to Egypt, where they encountered Joseph for the first time in over 20 years. Joseph recognized them. They did not recognize Joseph, but eventually Joseph showed his family kindness and invited them to come and live in Egypt. Because of his status, Joseph's status, his whole extended family was allowed to settle in a land of Egypt called Goshen. Genesis 46 lists the names of all those who made the move, and then says, all those who went to Egypt with Jacob, those who were his direct descendants, not counting his sons' wives, numbered 66 persons. With the 2 sons who had been born to Joseph in Egypt, the members of Jacob's family which went to Egypt were 70 in all. In the beginning of Exodus, we hear about a considerable passage of time within just a few verses. So Joseph and his brothers died, but the Israelites increased in number greatly. Then we are told that a new king came to power in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Joseph had been instrumental in getting Egypt through famine. That's what gave them their favor. That's what grandfathered the Israelite people into Egyptian favor. Who was this new king who didn't know what Joseph had done for Egypt? We can't know that for sure, but the Bible seems to imply that the favor Joseph won was forgotten relatively quickly. So yes, a whole generation has passed away, but it does not seem we're talking about hundreds of years of the Israelites living peacefully in Egypt. The next person the Bible will follow closely is Moses, and him we can date more precisely. 1 Kings chapter 6 says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. By the time you get to Solomon, dates are widely considered reliable, with the 4th year of Solomon being 966 BC. That would place the Exodus at 1446 and the birth of Moses at 1526. The pharaohs around the time of Moses, without getting into a little bit of question about Egyptian chronology, are likely Ahmose the first, Amenhotep the first, and Thutmose the first. So, sometime after the Israelites are settled in Egypt, a new king comes along and reverses their fortunes. Perhaps during the 1700s, the Hyksos had control over much of Egypt at that time. These were foreign invaders, so that could explain why a new king would not know or would not care what Joseph had previously done for the country. So the Israelites were oppressed. They were forced into hard labor, and eventually, to control their population, Pharaoh issued an order that newborn babies be killed. And this is when we hear about Moses. Moses' mother defied that order to throw her son into the Nile River. But when she could no longer hide him, she placed him in a basket among the reeds along the banks of the river. It was actually Pharaoh's daughter who found him, and she ended up adopting him and giving him the name Moses. Although Moses would grow up in Pharaoh's house as Egyptian royalty, he eventually fell out of Pharaoh's favor when he sided with Israel rather than Egypt. He came to the defense of an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he helped the Hebrew, and he killed the Egyptian. Then he fled the country to escape the wrath of Pharaoh. It's actually the martyr Stephen's speech in Acts chapter 7 that tells us Moses was 40 years old at this time. While Moses was away, he encountered God in a burning bush. God gave him instructions to go back to Egypt because he was choosing him to set his people free, to bring them out of the land of Egypt and into the land that he had promised to Abraham. Now, Moses had lots of excuses why it shouldn't be him to do this or why he didn't want to do this, but God had answers for all of them, including that his brother Aaron would help him. So Moses is set to go back to Egypt, and he's now about 80 years old. What else is going on in the world besides Egypt? Some well-known writings now exist, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh and Hammurabi's Code. Some date one of the sacred texts of Hinduism about the time of Moses. Language continued to evolve because the first alphabetic writings are dated roughly around this time period as well. In our part of the world, the Olmec civilization began around the same time as Moses in modern-day Mexico. Back in the book of Exodus, then begins a series of back and forth between Pharaoh and Moses. Now, this Pharaoh at this time is probably either Thutmose III or Amenhotep II. It was time for God to move history along. God had decided now that his people were going to move to the next chapter of his plan for them. So this was going to happen, but Pharaoh was resistant. And why shouldn't he be? From his perspective, he was about to lose a huge slave workforce. So yes, he resisted. To summarize about 7 chapters of Exodus, Moses and Aaron appeared to Pharaoh, told him, let the people go. Pharaoh said no. They did miracles. Pharaoh said no. That's when the 10 plagues come in. First, it's blood. The Nile River turns to blood. But Pharaoh says no, his heart was hard. He's not going to let the people go. Then frogs invade the land. Pharaoh's heart is hard. He's not going to let the people go. And then it's all sorts of pests coming in. And Pharaoh's heart is hard. But he tells Moses and Aaron, pray to your God. Take away these insects, whatever it happened to be at the time. And they did. They prayed and God took it away. But then Pharaoh didn't let the people go. His heart was hard every time. Finally, God was going to act. God was going to force Pharaoh's hand. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn son of the female slave who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites, not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come to me, bowing down before me and saying, 'Go, you and all the people who follow you.' After that I will leave." Then Moses, hot with anger, left Pharaoh. Meanwhile, the Israelite people would follow a very specific set of instructions so that the angel of death would pass over their houses. This became an annual celebration called the Passover, celebrated on the evening of Nisan the 14th. At this time, God instituted the Jewish calendar. After the angel of death had claimed the lives of the firstborn of every Egyptian household, Pharaoh demanded that the Israelites leave. And they did. They finally left. But Pharaoh changed his mind, and he gathered his army, and he pursued the Israelites, and he pursued them until Egypt had them hemmed in. Egypt had Israel stuck between themselves and between the Red Sea. But God was not done yet. In a great display of God's triumph over those who continually mock and reject him, the Israelites were guided to safety in dramatic, miraculous fashion. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. Thus, a long and significant part of Israel's history came to an end. From there, the people would make their way to Mount Sinai eventually, but that would take 3 months. Unfortunately, just as modern-day Christians are not always characterized by gratitude after a great showing of God's grace, so the Israelite people's behavior was less than ideal. They complained about food, they complained about water, they even suggested that they had had it better in Egypt. This rebellion would come with consequences eventually, but the predominant theme of Israelite history is God's grace. The predominant theme of the entire Bible is God's grace. Recognize that the history of you is the same story, a series of acts of grace that God bestows on you. I'm Pastor Clinton. God bless your efforts to study His story.